Prince Lothric was born for one purpose: to link the fire and become a Lord of Cinder. His entire life was designed around this single moment. He was kept weak, kept frail, educated by scholars who taught him everything about the cycle of fire and the cost of keeping it alive. And when the time came, Lothric looked at everything he'd been taught and said no. His older brother Lorian didn't argue. He didn't try to convince Lothric to fulfill his duty. Instead, Laurian took Lothric's curse into his own body, crippling himself so his brother wouldn't have to suffer alone. And together, the twin princes locked themselves in the highest tower of Lothric Castle and waited for the world to end. I'm telling you the complete tragedy of Lothric and Lorian, how they were raised, what they were taught, why Lothric refused to link the fire, and why, in the boss fight, Lorian crawls back to resurrect his brother over and over again, no matter how many times you kill him, because he would rather die 1,000 times than let Lothric face the world alone. Lothric wasn't a normal kingdom with normal ambitions. It was a biological and spiritual factory designed for a single purpose. Every institution within its walls existed to ensure that a worthy heir could link the first flame. The city wasn't built for the people who lived there, but for the one who'd eventually burn. What the games establish is that the entire civilization was a machine. This wasn't a place of random growth or historical accident. It was a calculated effort to defy the dark. The cost of this obsession was visible in every golden tower and every heavy wall. It was a kingdom that had traded its soul for a chance to keep the fire alive. The three pillars of the state, the high priestess, the scholars, and the knights, were the primary gears of this machine. They didn't just serve a king, they served a destiny. Each pillar had a specific role in the maintenance of the royal bloodline. The high priestess provided the spiritual guidance and the holy blessings. The scholars provided the arcane research and the ancient knowledge. The knights provided the physical force and the absolute protection. Together, they created an environment where a child wasn't a person, but a project. They were the architects of a state that valued its fuel more than its subjects. Engineering a Lord of Cinder required more than just blood. It required a culture of absolute devotion. The people of Lothric were raised to believe that the fire linking was the highest possible good. They were taught that their lives were secondary to the health of the flame. This fundamentalism permeated every level of society. It wasn't just the royal family that was obsessed. It was the entire kingdom. They'd built their houses and their temples around a single horrific act. They were a civilization that was waiting to be sacrificed. The weight of this expectation was a heavy burden that every citizen carried from birth. The architecture of the city reflected this divine ambition. The towers rose toward the clouds, reaching as high as possible. It appears that the goal was to bring the heir close to the divine flame. The buildings weren't just shelter, they were tools. They were designed to channel the power of the gods and the light of the sun. The verticality of Lothric was a physical declaration of its purpose. It was a kingdom that was trying to climb out of the dark. Every stone and every bridge was a step toward the kiln. It was a landscape of ambition that had lost its way in the fog of the end. The mechanical nature of the state was its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. It was efficient at producing a candidate, but it wasn't efficient at producing a human being. By treating the royal heir as a component, the kingdom stripped away his agency. He wasn't allowed to have a life of his own. He was only allowed to have a duty. This created a profound isolation for the princes. They were the center of the world, yet they were entirely alone. The machine of Lothric didn't have room for brotherly love or personal choice. It only had room for the fire. The cost of this civilization was a world that had stopped being real. Lothric was a place of high ideals and deep scholarship, but it was all directed toward a lie. The people were guarding a throne for a lord who hadn't yet been born. They were maintaining a kingdom that was already a graveyard. The beauty of the city was a mask for the rot at its center. It was a factory that was running out of raw materials. The machine was still turning, but the gears were starting to grind. Lothric was the ultimate expression of Gwyn's fear, a kingdom that had become a monster to save a god's legacy. Oceiros didn't see sons, he saw legitimacy. He was a man consumed by the obsession with the royal bloodline. To him, his children weren't individuals with their own lives. They were tools. They were the physical proof that his reign was blessed by the gods. He viewed the production of an heir as his primary duty as a king. Everything else was secondary. He turned the palace into a grand stage where his family were merely actors. They were playing roles that had been written by Gwyn centuries ago. Oceiros was a man who traded his fatherhood for a chance to be a part of history. Before his second son was even born, Oceiros had already turned him into a monument. He named the kingdom after the child, tying the land to the boy's identity. He commissioned statues of the prince wielding a sacred platinum sword. He wanted the world to see a triumphant champion, even before the child had drawn its first breath. This wasn't an act of love. It was an act of propaganda. Environmental storytelling across the game suggests that the king was more interested in the image of his son than the reality. He was building a legend before he'd even built a cradle. The child was a symbol of a future that Oceiros refused to let go. The royal bloodline was a sacred obsession for the king. He believed that the purity of his lineage was the only thing that could save the world. He spent his days in the archives, researching the ancient blood of the gods. He wanted his children to be the ultimate heirs to the flame. This focus on genetics and divinity was a cold, clinical process. It wasn't about the warmth of a family, it was about the potency of a soul. Oceiros was a man who looked at his sons and saw only numbers and potentials. He was an engineer of the spirit, trying to build a lord out of pieces of the past. Oceiros' emblem embodied his entire philosophy. It was a great bird gazing upward toward a crown. It wasn't an image of protection or care. It was an image of ambition and reaching. He was always looking for something higher, something more divine. He wanted to climb the ladder of the gods, and his sons were the rungs. This obsession with status and legacy blinded him to the suffering of his children. He didn't see the frailty of Lothric as a tragedy for a child. He saw it as a flaw in the product. He was a father who'd lost the ability to feel anything but the hunger for legitimacy. The palace was a museum of the king's ambition. Every statue and every painting was a reminder of what the princes were supposed to be. They lived in a world of expectations that they could never fulfill. Oceiros had created a reality where failure was unthinkable. He'd invested so much in the legend of Lothric that he couldn't accept the reality of his sickly son. This sunk cost thinking was the beginning of his madness. He was a man who'd built his entire life around a lie, and he was willing to do anything to keep the lie alive. The princes were just the latest victims of his desperate need to matter. The tragedy of Oceiros is the tragedy of a man who loved a legacy more than his children. He gave them a kingdom, but he didn't give them a father. He gave them a crown, but he didn't give them a choice. He was a ruler who'd become a prisoner of his own propaganda. By the time the fire began to fade, he was already lost in his research and his dreams. He'd created a world where the only thing that mattered was the royal blood. He was a father who'd become a monster, a king who'd become a ghost, ruling over a family that he'd already destroyed with his expectations. The Queen of Lothric is a figure shrouded in mystery and divinity. It appears that she was Gwynevere herself, or at least a direct descendant of the goddess of sunlight. She brought the divine blood of the gods into the Lothric line, providing the essential spark that the kingdom's machine required. Her presence in the palace was a sign that the gods had not yet abandoned the world. She blessed the holy water of the kingdom and provided comfort to the knights. She was a symbol of bounty and warmth in a land that was increasingly focused on sacrifice and ash. Her role was to provide the biological foundation for the ultimate Lord of Cinder. The fragments of lore around this point toward a queen who was more than just a figurehead. She visited the cemetery of ash to wish good fortune to the unkindled, showing a compassion that was rare in the royal family. She seemed to understand the cost of the cycle in a way that Oceiros did not. While the king was obsessed with legitimacy, the queen was focused on the individuals caught in the machine. But even her divine warmth wasn't enough to save the family. She was a mother who was watching her children be used as experiments. She was a goddess who was witnessing the total corruption of the light she once represented. The departure of the queen was a turning point for the kingdom. She quietly vanished after the birth of her third child, Ocelot. Her exit wasn't a public event, but a silent retreat. Why she left is one of the most significant gaps in the lore. Perhaps she couldn't bear to see what her husband had become. Perhaps she saw the monstrous nature of her youngest child and realized that the bloodline was beyond saving. Her disappearance left a massive power vacuum in the castle. Without her moderating influence, the three pillars of the state became more radical and more fundamentalist. The kingdom lost its heart and was left with only its mechanical brain. What little is confirmed suggests that the queen's absence was the beginning of the end for Lothric. Without the goddess of sunlight, the city became a place of shadow and obsession. The religious institutions turned toward the dark and the chaos of the archives. The knights became more brutal, and the scholars became more secretive. The family that was supposed to save the world was now falling apart. Oceiros descended into the depths of the palace, and the princes were left alone in their tower. The queen had been the only thing holding the madness at bay, and when she left, the madness took over completely. The legacy of the queen remained in the items she left behind. The holy water and the miracles of bounty were the only traces of her time in Lothric. She was a mother who'd tried to give her sons a chance, but she'd been defeated by the weight of their father's ambition. Her departure was a statement of defeat. She'd realized that even the blood of a goddess wasn't enough to fix a broken cycle. She left her sons to face a fate she couldn't change. It's a tragic image of a mother who has to walk away from her children to survive her husband's madness. She was the sunlight that went out before the fire. The queen's role in the family was a bridge between the old age of gods and the new age of cinders. She provided the connection to Gwyn's lineage, but she also provided the humanity that the kingdom was trying to erase. When she vanished, that bridge was broken. The princes were left as the final remnants of a divine line that no longer had a home. They were the children of a goddess who'd fled and a king who'd gone mad. They were the orphans of a civilization that was waiting for them to die. The queen's disappearance was the final proof that the light of Anor Londo was gone for good. Lorian was the elder prince, and he was the pride of the kingdom. He was born to be a knight, not a sacrifice. While his brother was being prepared for holy martyrdom, Lorian was being trained to rule and to fight. He was the crown prince, a traditional hero who was titanic in strength and powerful in spirit. He was raised by the church and the military, receiving the ancient brass armor that had been handed down through the royal family. He was the shield of Lothric, a man whose entire identity was built around physical form and military victory. He was the one who was supposed to lead the kingdom into a new age of glory. The confirmed lore would suggest that Laurian was a titan of the battlefield. He wasn't a subtle or a magical figure. He was a warrior of silver and iron. His name itself may derive from the word for lord, suggesting that he was the primary heir to the throne. He represented the physical health of the royal bloodline. While Lothric was being kept in a laboratory, Lorian was out in the world, winning battles and earning the respect of his knights. He was the favorite son, the one who fulfilled the king's vision of a champion. He was everything his brother wasn't: healthy, strong, and capable of holding a sword. The distinction between the two brothers was the foundation of their early lives. They lived in the same castle, but they inhabited two completely separate destinies. Lorian was the future of the state, and Lothric was the fuel for the fire. This hierarchy was meant to ensure the stability of the kingdom. One son would rule the world, and the other would save it. This was the mechanical plan of Oceiros and the scholars. They didn't see the princes as brothers. They saw them as functions. Lorian was the guardian, and Lothric was the object to be guarded. It was a cold arrangement that ignored the human connection between the two boys. Lorian's training was a brutal process of physical refinement. He was taught to be the ultimate protector. He learned the arts of combat from the finest masters in the kingdom. He was a man of action and few words, even before the curse took his voice. His identity was tied to his armor and his blade. He was a pillar of the kingdom's military strength. But despite his position as the heir, he spent much of his time with his younger brother. He was the only person who saw Lothric as more than an experiment. He was the one who looked past the frailty and the clawed hands to see the person underneath. The elder prince was a hero of the old order. He represented the chivalry and the power that Lothric was trying to preserve. He was a man who believed in duty and honor, but his duty was eventually twisted by the desperation of his family. He was forced to choose between his glory as a knight and his love for his brother. This conflict is the core of his tragedy. He was a man who'd every reason to be selfish, yet he chose to be the most selfless person in the kingdom. He was a crown prince who gave up his crown for a sick child. Lorian's life before the curse was a series of triumphs. He was a legendary warrior who'd earned the right to rule. He was a man who could have lived a life of luxury and power. But he saw the suffering of his brother, and he saw the madness of his father. He realized that his strength was a resource that his brother didn't have. He decided that being a knight was less important than being a brother. He was the firstborn who'd eventually become the sacrifice, the hero who'd eventually become the cripple. He was the shield of the prince, and he was preparing to become the crutch. Prince Lothric was born as a shadowed soul. From the moment he entered the world, he was physically wasted. His skin was pale, and his breathing was labored. His legs were weak and unable to support his weight, and his fingers were clawed like the roots of a dying tree. He was a child born to die, a failure of the royal bloodline's biological engineering. The irony was a peak expression of the world's cruelty. The one soul in the kingdom that was capable of saving the world was trapped in a body that could barely survive a drafty room. He was the ultimate goal of the state, yet he was its most fragile component. The records indicate that Lothric never truly grew up. Even as he aged, he remained the size of a child. He never outgrew his baby clothes. The palace was filled with statues of a triumphant champion, wielding a platinum sword, but the reality was a boy who couldn't even stand. The image of this emaciated child surrounded by the propaganda of a warrior is one of the most quietly devastating details in the castle. He was living in a world of giants while he remained a small, broken thing, and he was the prince of a kingdom that refused to acknowledge his reality. The platinum sword was a symbol of this disconnect. It was crafted and blessed by Emma, the high priestess, long before Lothric could ever hold it. It was a divine weapon meant for a holy king. But the prince's hands were too weak to grip the hilt. He was a boy who was surrounded by the tools of a life he could never lead. He spent his days in a lavish bed, staring at a sword he'd never swing and a throne he'd never sit on. He was a prisoner of his own destiny, a child who was being kept alive by magic because his body had already given up. Dialogue from this character implies that Lothric was fully aware of his own state from a young age. He wasn't a naive child. He was a cynical observer of his own decay. He saw the healers and the scholars who crowded his room, and he knew they weren't there to save him. They were there to save the fire. He was a boy who was being maintained like a piece of equipment. He was the shadowed soul, a being that existed in the space between life and death. His frailty was a source of constant pain, a physical reminder of the burden that had been placed on him by a world he didn't care about. The royal family tried to hide his condition from the public, maintaining the illusion of the golden heir. But inside the castle, the truth was unavoidable. Lothric was a sickly ghost in a palace of marble. He was the center of a mechanical religion that didn't know how to handle his weakness. The obsession of the scholars only grew as the prince failed to improve. They viewed his body as a puzzle to be solved, a biological error that needed to be corrected by any means necessary. He was a child who was being poked and prodded by men who saw him as a soul with a faulty container. Lothric's early years were a series of medical and magical interventions. He was subjected to every miracle and every soul transfusion the kingdom could provide. But nothing worked. He remained frail and small. This failure of the machine was the beginning of the kingdom's descent into madness. The scholars became more desperate, and the king became more unstable. The shadowed soul of the prince was the first sign that the age of fire was truly reaching its end. He was a child who was born into the twilight, a boy who'd already been consumed by the fire before he'd even reached the kiln. Part 6. The machine turns against its product. When it became clear that Lothric would never grow into his intended role, the kingdom's obsession turned into torture. The royal family and the scholars didn't mourn the tragedy of a sick child and move on. They escalated their efforts. They were victims of a sunk-cost thinking that made admitting failure unthinkable. They had already built the statues and the prophecies around this boy. They had already named the kingdom after him. To abandon him was to abandon the legitimacy of the entire state. So, instead of a nursery, the prince's room became a laboratory where the repulsive acts began. What little is confirmed suggests that the scholars used every avenue possible to force the prince's ascension. They worked with the crystal sages to explore the forbidden magic of the archives. They sought the counsel of the first scholar, a man who possessed a dangerous knowledge of the soul. They were trying to manufacture the strength that Lothric's body couldn't produce. This included surgical procedures and soul manipulation that was beyond the limits of traditional morality. The prince wasn't being raised. He was being engineered. He was the subject of an ongoing experiment that ignored his suffering in favor of his utility. Oceiros was the driving force behind this escalation. His obsession with the bloodline had turned into a form of mania. He was convinced that there must be a way to fix the flaw in his son. He spent his nights in the archives, looking for any scrap of information that could save his legacy. He didn't see the pain in his son's eyes. He only saw the fading light of the first flame. He was a man who'd lost his grip on reality, believing that he could outsmart the laws of life and death through sheer willpower and forbidden research. The prince was a victim of his father's refusal to accept the truth. The scholars of the Grand Archives were complicit in this cruelty. They saw the prince as the ultimate intellectual challenge. They were willing to push the boundaries of science and magic to achieve a result. They used soul transfusions from other candidates, trying to graft the vigor of the strong onto the body of the weak. This process was a violation of the natural order, a repulsive act that stained the history of the kingdom. Lothric was a boy who was being pulled in every direction by men who claimed to be his saviors. He was the product of a machine that had turned against itself in its desperation to survive. Lothric's existence during this time was a nightmare of needles and spells. He was a child who was being haunted by the ghosts of his own potential. Every experiment left him weaker and more cynical. He began to understand the true nature of the kingdom's love. It was a conditional love, based entirely on his ability to link the fire. He was a tool that was being sharpened by men who didn't care if the blade broke. This period of his life is what fueled his eventual heresy. He learned to hate the cycle because he'd experienced the absolute worst of its mechanical heart. The laboratory of the Grand Archives was the birthplace of a heretic. In the middle of the pain and the research, Lothric found the clarity to say no. He realized that the world he was being asked to save was a world that was willing to torture a child for its own continuation. He saw the repulsive acts for what they were, a desperate attempt to keep a dead age alive. The machine of Lothric had succeeded in creating a soul of immense power, but it had failed to create a lord who was willing to use it. The scholars had built a monster of logic and pain, and they were about to find out that a monster doesn't always follow the plan. Part 7. Repulsive Acts. The Curse that Bound Two Souls. The climax of the scholars' experimentation was a ritual so horrific that the games describe it only in fragments. Desperate to fix the prince's frailty, the royal family resorted to repulsive acts to bind Lothric's soul to Laurian's. The evidence points toward a ritual of soul tethering, a process that fused the essences of the two brothers into a single thread. They hoped that Laurian's immense vitality would leak into his younger brother, providing the strength that Lothric's emaciated body lacked. It was a symbiotic curse designed to create a single, potent Lord of Cinder out of two separate lives. Based on what the games show, this ritual was a fundamental violation of the soul. It wasn't a blessing or a gift. It was a shackle. The curse tied their lives together so completely that they could no longer be parted. If one suffered, the other felt the blow. If one died, the other would be pulled back from the brink. They were no longer two individuals with their own destinies. They were a single existence divided between two bodies. Oh, this was the ultimate solution of the Lothric bloodline, a desperate attempt to manufacture a savior by cannibalizing their own sons. It was an act of total spiritual desperation. The result of the curse was catastrophic for Lorian. The vitality that was supposed to save Lothric instead drained the elder brother. Lorian was rendered mute and crippled, his once mighty legs unable to support his weight. He became a mirror of his brother's physical weakness. To give Lothric a soul that could burn, Lorian had to give up the life that made him a warrior. It was a transaction of blood and spirit that left both princes broken. The elder was now a cripple who had to crawl, and the younger was still a sickly child who had to be carried. The repulsive acts had succeeded in binding them, but they'd failed to fix the problem. Crucially, the text says that Lorian willingly submitted to this destruction. He wasn't a victim of a ritual he didn't understand. He wished it so. This detail is the most significant part of the entire tragedy. Lorian saw the torture his brother was enduring in the name of the flame, and he decided to step in. He chose to share the burden. He chose to take the sickness into his own body so that Lothric wouldn't have to face it alone. It was an act of love that surpassed every duty he owed to the state. He traded his crown and his strength for a chance to be his brother's crutch. The curse turned the two princes into a symbiotic unit of defiance. They were no longer the tools of their father. They were a partnership of pain. This bond is what allowed them to eventually say no to the cycle. They had a shared soul, which gave them a shared perspective. They saw the repulsive acts for the horror they were. They realized that the kingdom would do anything to keep the fire going, including destroying its own heirs. This shared realization was the foundation of their rebellion. They had been tethered together by a curse, but they stayed together by choice. The repulsive acts are the dark heart of the Lothric story. They represent the moment when the kingdom's obsession with the fire turned into a crime against humanity. The royal family had sacrificed the souls of their sons for a fire that was already fading. They'd created a union rooted in a curse and perpetuated by grief. The princes were the living evidence of a civilization that had lost its way. They were a single, four-armed tragedy, waiting for the world to notice that they were no longer willing to be its fuel. The curse was meant to save the fire, but it instead created the only beings strong enough to let it die. Section 3. Laurian's Sacrifice. Part 8. Slayer of the Demon Prince. Before the curse took his legs and his voice, Lorian was already a legend. He was not a secondary character in the kingdom's history. He was its greatest hero. Item descriptions confirm that Lorian single-handedly slew the demon prince, a victory that marked the end of the demon's power in the world. This wasn't a small skirmish or a lucky kill. It was a titanic battle against one of the last great lords of an age of fire. Lorian descended into the smouldering lake and faced the beast alone, proving that he was the most accomplished warrior of his generation. This feat is essential for understanding what he eventually gave up. The battle with the demon prince left a permanent mark on Lorian's equipment. His ultra-great sword was scorched black by the demon's dying flames, turning it from a silver blade into a blackened slab of iron. The metal was literally melted and warped by the heat of the encounter. This weapon is a physical record of Lorian's strength and his bravery. He was a man who'd faced the absolute worst of the chaos and emerged victorious. He had earned his place at the head of the kingdom's military. He was a crown prince who'd proven his worth through blood and fire. He was a hero whose story was supposed to lead to a throne. Understanding the scale of this victory is necessary to appreciate Lorian's sacrifice. He wasn't a weak man who'd nothing to lose. He was at the height of his power. He was celebrated by the knights and feared by his enemies. He'd a future of rule and glory ahead of him. When he chose to accept the curse for his brother, he wasn't just giving up his health. He was giving up a legacy. He was throwing away a life that most people in Lordran would have died for. The blackened greatsword he carries is a reminder of the warrior he once was, a man who could stand tall against a demon prince but chose to kneel for a sick brother. The demon prince was a remnant of the old chaos, a force that had been a threat since the age of the Witch of Izalith. By killing it, Lorian was fulfilling the ultimate duty of a knight of fire. He was clearing away the old shadows to make room for the new light. But the fire he fought for didn't reward him. It only asked for more. His victory over the demon was just a prelude to the repulsive acts of his family. The kingdom took his triumph and used it as proof that he was strong enough to carry the burden of the curse. His heroism was turned into a tool for his own destruction. In the boss fight, Lorian's sword still carries the embers of that ancient flame. It's a weapon that is both a tool for killing and a crutch for standing. The blackened iron is a symbol of a life that was burned for a cause. Lorian is a man of fire who's been consumed by the very element he defended. He is the slayer of demons who has become a crippled sentinel. This history of combat is visible in every ferocity of his teleportation and every weight of his strikes. He's not a monster. He's a veteran of a holy war who has decided that the war is over. Lorian's feat in the smouldering lake is one of the few confirmed details of his life before the curse. It establishes his character as one of absolute courage and strength. He didn't have to share his brother's pain. He could have stayed the hero of the kingdom, but he chose a different path. He chose a path that led away from the statues and the glory. He chose to be the unyielding sword of the prince, even if he had to crawl to do it. His victory over the demon prince was his last act as an individual. After that, he became a part of a shared soul. His glory scorched into the iron of his blade. Part 9. He chose this. The most significant detail of Lorian's story is that he wasn't a victim of the curse. He was a volunteer. The confirmed lore describes how he wished it so. This changes every aspect of our understanding of the two brothers. Lorian wasn't forced into disability by a cruel father or a desperate scholar. He chose it. He saw the repulsive acts being committed against his younger brother, and he saw the agony of a child who'd no choice in his own destiny. Lorian decided that he'd rather be a cripple by his brother's side than a king on a distant throne. He accepted the curse because he loved Lothric more than he loved his own divinity. What the games establish is that this was a total act of self-sacrifice. Lorian had everything. He was the heir, the slayer of demons, and the pride of the kingdom. He had his voice, his legs, and his soul. He traded all of it for a sick boy who was being tortured by a machine. This wasn't a momentary impulse. It was a life-altering decision. He knew the cost. He knew that by tethering his soul to Lothric's, he would lose his identity and his health. He did it anyway. This is one of the most selfless acts in the entire trilogy, an act of love that stands out in a world built on fear and ambition. Why did he do it? The games never provide a single answer, which makes the choice feel more authentic. It wasn't about a religious vow or a political maneuver. It was about a brother. Lorian saw the heir to the fire being crushed by a weight no child should have to carry. He saw the laboratory and the medical procedures. He decided to step in and share the sickness. He wanted to give Lothric a voice and a soul, even if it meant losing his own. He was the only person in the kingdom who saw Lothric as a human being instead of a resource. His devotion was a quiet, she unremarked upon miracle in a palace of shadow. Lorian's sacrifice went unrecognized by the kingdom. The knights and the priestesses continued to see them as a single chosen king. They didn't build statues of the brother who'd crippled himself for love. They only cared about the result, a lord who could link the fire. Lorian was the unsung hero, the man who'd vanished into the shadow of his brother's destiny. He didn't ask for reward or recognition. He only wanted to be the unyielding sword for the prince. He accepted the silence and the crawling as a small price to pay for the bond they now shared. He was a hero who traded his glory for a quiet domestic loyalty. This choice is what makes the fight against the princes so devastating. You aren't fighting two monsters. You're fighting a bond of absolute devotion. Every time Lorian crawls across the floor, he is a reminder of the choice he made. Every time he defends his brother, he is fulfilling the vow he made in the laboratory. He is a man who's found his purpose not in a crown, but in a person. He is the only character in the game whose love is purely demonstrated through action. He doesn't need to speak to tell you why he's fighting. He is there because he chose to be. Lorian's devotion is the most human thing in the series. In a world where gods burn themselves for fire and kings go mad for bloodlines, Lorian gave himself up for a brother. He proved that even in the middle of a mechanical factory for Lords of Cinder, love can still grow. He was the crown prince who decided that his crown was a lie and his brother was the truth. His sacrifice is the reason the princes were strong enough to say no. They had each other, and that was more than the kingdom or the fire could ever offer them. Lorian chose the curse, and in doing so, he chose the only freedom he'd ever know. Part 10. What the curse made him. The ritual to bind the two brothers worked, but the cost was absolute. To give Lothric a voice and a soul, Lorian had to lose his own. He became mute and crippled, his once mighty legs becoming useless just like his brothers. The legendary knight was reduced to crawling through the dust of the palace he was meant to rule. He became a silent sentinel, a shadow of the hero who'd slain the demon prince. Everything that made him an individual was stripped away, leaving only the bond to his brother. He was the crown prince who'd become a servant, a titanic warrior who'd become a ghost. The curse didn't just share the burden, it redistributed the identity of the entire royal line. Based on what the games show, Lorian's physical transformation was a visible sign of the cycle's cruelty. He no longer stood tall as the shield of the kingdom. He dragged his heavy armor across the floor, his great sword serving as a metal crutch. He was a man who'd been hollowed out by his own devotion. His silence was a profound weight in a world filled with the noise of scholars and priests. He didn't speak because he'd no words left to give. His soul was tied to Lothric's, and his voice had been lost in the exchange. He was the physical manifestation of the price that love pays in a world of machines. Every movement he made was a struggle against the very power he'd once wielded. The knight's existence was a lonely vigil. He lived only to serve his brother's will, a silent protector who never left Lothric's side. The kingdom saw him as a tool, but Lothric saw him as a savior. This reversal of roles was the final irony of their story. The strong brother was now the one who needed help to move, and the weak brother was the one who provided the direction. Lorian didn't seem to regret the choice. He accepted the crawling and the silence with a grim dignity. He was a warrior who'd found a new kind of battle, one that didn't require a voice or a pair of working legs. He was the unyielding sword of the prince, and he'd prove it until the end of the world. It appears that the curse created a symbiotic relationship that surpassed any natural bond. Lorian wasn't just Asgard. He was an extension of Lothric's own being. When Lothric spoke, it was with a soul that had been fortified by Lorian's strength. When Lorian fought, it was with a purpose that had been defined by Lothric's mind. They were a single existence divided between two broken bodies. This union was the ultimate act of defiance against the royal family's plans. They'd tried to build a lord, and they'd instead built a pair of outcasts who'd no interest in the fire. Lorian's sacrifice was the foundation of their rebellion, a silent no that had echoed through the halls of the castle forever. Lorian's state in the final game is a testament to the power of persistence. He is a boss who fights from his knees, yet he is more formidable than most knights who stand. His every swing carries the weight of his history and his pain. He is not a monster, but a man who's been reshaped by a curse he chose. The silence of his character makes him one of the most poignant figures in the trilogy. He doesn't need dialogue to tell us his story. We see it in the way he guards the door and the way he teleports to his brother's side. He is the silent hero of a tragic age, a man who gave up his life to save his brother's spirit. He is the one who stayed when the mother fled and the father went mad. Section 4. The Mentor and the Idea That Changed Everything. Part 11. Aldia, Scholar of the First Sin, the First Teacher. The decision to abandon the fire wasn't a sudden whim for the young prince. It appears that his conviction was shaped by the teachings of a private mentor, a man who possessed a deep skepticism of the First Flame. This figure is mentioned in the records as the first scholar of the Grand Archives, and item descriptions strongly imply he was Aldia, the scholar of the first sin from the second game. Aldia was a being who existed outside the cycle and hated the fire linking that Gwyn had started. He didn't come to Lothric to teach a king how to rule. He came to teach a prince how to be a heretic. He found a student in a frail boy who'd every reason to doubt the benevolence of the gods. The connection between the two games is confirmed through the sorcery known as Soul Stream. This spell, which Aldia created in the past, exists in Lothric under a different name, but with the same devastating power. It was taught by this first scholar, a man who'd seen the rise and fall of countless kingdoms and realized that the cycle was a lie. He whispered the secrets of the first sin into Lothric's ear, showing him that the fire was a shackle rather than a blessing. He taught the boy that the world was a fleeting dream and that the lords of Cinder were just slaves to a dying sun. This education provided the intellectual ammunition that Lothric needed to reject his engineered destiny. Aldia was a man of pure truth, a scholar who'd sacrificed his own humanity to understand the nature of the world. He didn't offer Lothric comfort or hope. He offered him clarity. He showed the prince that his suffering wasn't a noble sacrifice for the world, but a mechanical requirement for a stagnant age. He convinced the boy that the legacy of lords was a deception that had been used to control humanity for millennia. This philosophy was a radical departure from the teachings of the High Priestess or the other scholars. It was a call to rebellion, a suggestion that the prince had the right to say no to the machine that had created him. Lothric was the perfect student for a heretic like Aldia. He was a boy who'd already experienced the worst of the kingdom's obsession. He knew that the doctors and the priests didn't care about his health, only about his soul's potency. Aldia gave a name to this cruelty and a reason for the prince's pain. He turned Lothric's physical weakness into a philosophical strength. If the prince was too weak to walk to the kiln, then he was the perfect person to stop the cycle by simply refusing to move. This mentorship was the most important event in the prince's life, the moment when the tool became a person. The presence of Aldia in the background of Lothric explains the total collapse of the kingdom's religious order. He'd introduced a poison into the heart of the archives, a doubt that eventually spread to the prince and his brother. The first scholar was a ghost from a previous age who'd returned to finish what he started. He wanted to see the cycle broken once and for all, and Lothric was the instrument he chose. The prince didn't arrive at his refusal through madness or fear. He arrived at it through study and logic. He was a hero of the dark because a scholar had shown him that the light was a prison. Part 12. What Aldia taught Lothric. The lessons Aldia gave to the young prince were centered on the rejection of the fundamental laws of the world. He taught Lothric that the fire linking was not an act of salvation, but a perpetuation of ancient deception. He argued that humans were never meant for the age of fire, but for the age of dark that was supposed to follow. By linking the flame, the lords were merely delaying a natural transition, burning themselves alive to maintain a world that refused to end. Aldia described the cycle as a shackle that Gwyn had placed on the world out of fear. He showed Lothric that the Lords of Cinder were not heroes, but victims of a god's refusal to let go. The scholar's philosophy was built on the idea that the world was a fleeting dream. He taught that the reality of the Age of Fire was an artificial state that required constant blood and souls to maintain. This perspective allowed Lothric to see past the propaganda of his father and the High Priestess. He realized that the statues and the prayers were just the noise of a machine that was trying to stay relevant. Aldia told the prince that he'd the right to refuse the burden that had been placed on him. He argued that the fire linking was a curse that had been inherited by the princes, a legacy of lords that they were under no obligation to fulfill. This education was a deep dive into the historical evidence of the cycle's failure. Aldia likely shared the stories of Vendrick and the other kings who tried to break the shackle and failed. He showed Lothric that every linking of the fire only led to a more exhausted and more grey world. He convinced the prince that the only way to be truly free was to let the fire go. This wasn't a suggestion of malice toward the world, but a request for honesty. Aldia wanted the world to face its natural end, and he wanted Lothric to be the one who finally allowed the lights to go out. He gave the boy a reason to believe that his refusal was the most noble act possible. Lothric learned to see the cycle as a prison for the human spirit. He saw that the kingdom's obsession with the bloodline was a symptom of this stagnation. He realized that the repulsive acts committed by his family were the logical conclusion of a system that valued fire more than life. Aldia's teaching gave the prince the intellectual strength to withstand the pressure of his destiny. He no longer felt guilty for his frailty. He saw it as a sign that he wasn't meant for the fire. He decided that if the world wanted to burn him, it would have to find a way to make him agree. And thanks to Aldia, he'd never agree. The scholar's influence was the most dangerous thing in the kingdom. He'd given the chosen heir a worldview that made the fire linking look like a crime. Lothric was no longer a sickly boy waiting for a sacrifice. He was a philosopher who'd found the ultimate flaw in the world's design. He saw the kiln not as a destination, but as a trap. This clarity is what makes Lothric such a compelling figure. He isn't a villain. He is a man who has heard the truth and decided to act on it. Aldia had taught him how to be a heretic, and in doing so, he'd given the prince a way to be free from the machine of his father. Part 13. A child who finally had a reason. Armed with Aldia's philosophy, Prince Lothric finally had a reason for his suffering. He realized that his physical weakness wasn't a curse from nature, but a sign of his unsuitability for a stagnant lie. He saw that the kingdom's attempts to fix him were just desperate efforts to maintain a mechanical tradition that no longer had a purpose. This realization changed his perspective on his own existence. He was no longer a failure of the bloodline. He was the only person in the kingdom who understood the truth. His frailty became his greatest strength, a physical justification for his refusal to participate in the cycle. Lothric's exact words, to let it all fade into nothing, were not a cry of anger, but a statement of resignation. He'd looked at the entire history of the world and found it unworthy of the price being demanded. He didn't want to be a god or a king. He wanted to be the last of his kind. He saw the legacy of lords as a burden that had already taken his mother and his father and his brother's voice. He decided that the fire linking was a curse that ended with him. This refusal was the most lucid act in the series, a conscious choice to embrace the quiet dark, rather than be used as fuel for a world that refused to die. The prince's refusal was a direct challenge to the fundamental laws of Lothric. He wasn't just staying in bed because he was tired. He was staying in bed because he was right. He understood that by doing nothing, he was achieving more than any warrior ever could. He was stopping the machine. This passive resistance was a source of total terror for the high priestess and the scholars. They didn't know how to handle a lord who simply wouldn't move. They had no tools for a philosopher who saw their religion as a lie. Lothric had found a way to win the game by refusing to play it. His decision was supported by Lorian, who'd seen the same horrors and reached the same conclusion. Together, the brothers became an island of refusal in a sea of obsession. They didn't care about the civil war that was beginning in the streets or the madness of their father in the garden. They only cared about each other and the silence they were waiting for. Lothric had found a purpose in his refusal that he'd never found in his duty. He was the mastermind behind the greatest rebellion in history, a boy who decided that the world had had enough light. He was ready to watch the fire fade, and he was ready for the dark. This clarity of purpose is what makes Lothric such a formidable opponent for the Ashen One. You aren't fighting a madman or a monster. You are fighting a man who has thought about the cycle with more clarity than anyone else in history. He isn't afraid of you. He is sorry for you. He sees you as just another slave to the fire, a tool that is being used to prolong a misery you don't understand. His refusal is a gift he is trying to offer the world, a chance for everything to finally stop hurting. He is the child who finally had a reason to say no, and he is the Lord who finally let the lights go out. Section 5, The Retreat, Part 14. Settled far, far away to watch the fire fade. When the time came to link the fire, the princes did something that no lord had ever done before. They didn't run to a distant land or hide in a secret cave. The records indicate they rejected their duty and settled far, far away to watch the fire fade from a distance. In practice, this meant they retreated to the topmost chamber of Lothric Castle, the most remote and isolated point in the entire kingdom. They stayed at the heart of the machine, but they remained emotionally and spiritually unreachable. They turned their backs on the world and simply waited for the end of the age. This retreat was a physical manifestation of their refusal. By moving to the highest point in the city, they were putting themselves out of reach of the priestesses and the knights who still demanded a sacrifice. They were behind layers of elite guards and the 3 primary pillars of the king's rule. To reach them, you've to fight through the best warriors the kingdom has left. They'd built a fortress within a fortress, a sanctuary of silence at the end of the world. They weren't hiding from the fire. They were waiting for it to go out. They were the lords of the top of the world, and they were content to watch the convergence from their balcony. The choice to stay in the castle was a deliberate act of defiance. They were mocking the very system that had created them. They were sitting on the thrones that had been designed for their sacrifice, but they were using them to rest instead of to burn. This passivity was the ultimate insult to the royal bloodline. They were the golden heirs who'd become a void. The kingdom was falling apart around them, but the brothers stayed in their room, a crippled knight and his frail prince, enjoying the only peace they'd ever known. They had realized that the farthest place in the world was the top of their own home. Their withdrawal triggered a total collapse of the political order in Lothric. When the heir refused to move, the machine of the state broke down. The three pillars turned on each other, and a civil war began in the streets. The scholars locked their doors, and the knights went mad. The entire kingdom was flooded with blood because a single boy decided to stay in bed. The princes watched all of this from their chamber, a high-altitude witness to the destruction of a dream. They didn't try to stop the war or save the people. They'd already decided that the world was beyond saving. The image of the brothers at the top of the castle is one of the most haunting in the game. They are the guardians of the end, the ones who are making sure the light actually goes out. They are waiting for the Ashen One to arrive, knowing that you are the final attempt by the cycle to force them back into the machine. They are prepared for the fight, but they aren't interested in the outcome. They've already made their peace with the dark. They are the princes who looked at the cycle and said no, and they are the ones who are finally letting the lights fade for good. Part 15. What the Chamber tells us. The chamber where the princes are found is unlike any other throne room in the series. Environmental storytelling suggests it isn't a place of rule, but a place of rest. White feathers cover the floor, a reference to the angelic faith that had emerged in the kingdom as an alternative to the fire linking. These feathers suggest a connection to divine messengers and a transcendence that exists beyond the cycle's logic. The room is quiet and intimate, filled with the discarded armor of a knight and the lavish bed of a sick child. It feels more like a bedroom than a palace, reflecting the brothers' desire to simply be a family rather than icons of a state. A Lothric is found sitting on his bed, looking calm and unsurprised by your arrival. He has spent his entire life resting in this room, a prisoner of his own frailty and his father's ambition. The space feels private and closed off from the horrors of the world below. There are no maps or war plans, only the silence of the top of the castle. This intimacy is what makes the encounter so devastating. You are intruding on the only piece of privacy these two men have ever had. You are bringing the violence of the world into their sanctuary. They are two people who have made their peace with the coming dark together. Lorian is found kneeling beside the bed, a silent sentinel who has never left his brother's side. His armor is scorched and his sword is broken, but his devotion is absolute. The room reflects this loyalty, with the elder brother serving as the primary shield for the younger. They aren't a king and a knight. They are two brothers who found a way to endure the end of the world in each other's company. The feathers on the floor create a sense of artificial divinity, a dream that they are clutching to as the reality of the fire fades. It is a beautiful and tragic place, a tomb for a bloodline that finally refused to burn. The presence of the feathers has led many to believe that the princes were involved in the angelic cult of Gertrude. This faith promised a escape from the cycle through divine intervention, a message that would have been very attractive to a prince who hated the fire. Whether they believed in the angels or not, the feathers symbolized their desire for something different. They wanted a light that didn't require blood and ash. They were looking for a way out of the machine. The chamber is the physical evidence of this search. a place where they could pretend the world was already over and the dark was already here. To the Ashen One, the room is just a boss arena. But to the princes, it was a home. It was the only place where they weren't tools or experiments. It was the place where they could talk and wait for the end. By entering the chamber, you are breaking the final seal of their refusal. You are the messenger of the cycle who has come to drag them back to the kiln. The intimate atmosphere of the room makes the ensuing violence feel like a desecration. You are killing the only family that was left in the kingdom, and you are doing it in the only place where they felt safe. Part 16. What the kingdom did without them. The refusal of the princes to link the fire triggered a catastrophic cascade of failure across the kingdom of Lothric. When the heir stayed in his bed, the machine of the state stopped working. The three pillars of the king's rule, the knights, the priestesses, and the scholars, turned on each other in a desperate struggle for control. The city fell into a brutal civil war, leaving the streets flooded with blood and the towers filled with ghosts. The political order that had been maintained for centuries collapsed in a matter of days. The kingdom that had been built to produce a lord of cinder was now destroying itself because that lord refused to burn. Records indicate that the madness of the king escalated during this time. Oceiros descended into the Grand Archives and, obsessed with finding a way to fix the failure of his sons, he turned to the forbidden knowledge of Seath the Scaleless, eventually transforming himself into a disgusting dragon hybrid. He abandoned his duties to the state to pursue a new heir who'd be strong enough to save the fire. The palace became a place of nightmare, with the king cradling an invisible child in a garden filled with rot. The family that was supposed to be the center of the world was now its most horrific failure. The power vacuum in the castle allowed other forces to move in. Pontiff Sulivan rose to power in Irithil and extended his influence into the Grand Archives. He sent his outrider knights as exiled enforcers to ensure that the fire linking remained impossible. The kingdom was no longer a unified force, but a collection of warring factions and mad survivors. The scholars locked their doors to hide their secrets, and the knights became wandering hollows who only knew how to kill. The entire civilization was being consumed by the very dark it had tried to prevent. The princes watched all of this from their chamber at the top of the castle. They didn't try to stop the war or offer an alternative. They'd already decided that the world wasn't worth saving. They saw the blood in the streets as the final proof that the Age of Fire was a mistake. Their passivity was a statement of total rejection. They were content to let the kingdom burn if it meant they didn't have to burn with it. They were the center of the storm, a quiet island of refusal, in a world that was drowning in its own obsession. The tragedy of Lothric the kingdom is that its greatest strength became its greatest weakness. Its entire structure was so focused on the fire linking that it had no backup plan for a refusal. When the machine failed, it had no way to repair itself. The civilization was a house of cards that had been built around a single child, and when that child walked away, the house fell. The civil war was the sound of a world that had run out of options. It was the end point of Gwyn's cycle, a kingdom that had become a graveyard because it had forgotten how to live for anything but the fire. Section 6, The Fight. Part 17, Phase 1. Meeting the brother who can't stand. Lorian enters the final confrontation in a state that should be impossible for a warrior of his stature. He doesn't stride into the arena with the practiced grace of a crown prince, nor does he wait for the challenger to approach his throne. Instead, he drags himself across the stone floor, his legs rendered useless by the curse he willingly accepted. Environmental storytelling across the game suggests that the space between worlds has become thin within the castle, allowing Lorian to use teleportation to compensate for his physical disability. He vanishes in a cloud of white light and reappears with a suddenness that defies the weight of his scorched armor. It's a brutal, jarring style of combat that turns his weakness into a terrifying tactical advantage. Every swing of his ultra greatsword is a visible struggle against the burden of his crippled body. He leans into his strikes with a ferocity that outshines every other knight you've encountered in the convergence of the lands. He isn't fighting for glory or the defense of a kingdom that's already fallen to ruin. He's fighting for the privacy and the safety of the frail brother who watches from the bed above. This desperation makes his movements unpredictable and violent. He uses the ground as a pivot point, swinging his massive blade with a strength that suggests his spirit is still as titanic as the day he faced the demons. He's a man who has been broken in every way that matters to a soldier, yet he refuses to stop being a shield. The records indicate that Lorian's holy power hasn't entirely faded, despite his mute and crippled state. He can still imbue his blade with a searing light, a remnant of the divine grace he once carried as the favorite son. When he teleports, it isn't a magical trick, but a distortion of reality, fueled by the bond he shares with Lothric. He's moving through the fabric of time itself to protect the one person who gives his life meaning. This phase of the fight is a lesson in the power of a singular focus. Lorian has no words, no titles, and no future. He only has the immediate necessity of killing the intruder who has come to drag his brother to the kiln. What little is confirmed suggests that Lorian's silence is a choice as much as it is a curse. He has nothing left to say to the world that demanded his brother's immolation. His sword, still blackened and molten from the heat of the smouldering lake, speaks for him. It tells the story of a hero who was abandoned by his father and used by his priests. Every time he crashes into the floor, it's a reminder of what he gave up. He is the unyielding sword of the prince, a man who has traded his crown for the right to crawl in the dirt for the person he loves. He is a warrior whose devotion is written in the blood he spills across the arena. The ferocity of his defense is what makes this encounter so memorable. He doesn't fight like a knight of the cycle. He fights like a cornered animal. There is a raw, instinctual quality to his movements that bypasses the formal training of the Lothric military. He isn't interested in a fair duel or an honorable exchange. He only wants you dead. This intensity is the result of centuries spent in the quiet of the topmost chamber. He has been watching the fire fade, and he isn't about to let a cinder seeker interrupt the end. He is the first line of defense for a heresy he helped create, and he's willing to die 1,000 times to hold the line. The player is forced to confront the geometry of his struggle. You aren't just dodging a blade, you're dodging a life's work of protection. Lorian's ability to appear behind you or strike from above is a manifestation of the curse's symbiotic power. He is the muscle for a mind that's already decided the world isn't worth saving. By the time you drop him to his knees, you realize that he hasn't been defeated by your skill alone. He's been worn down by the weight of a duty he never asked for, but refused to abandon. He falls in silence, his blackened sword slipping from his fingers, leaving the chamber in a temporary, heavy stillness. Part 18. The moment Lothric comes down. When Laurian is finally defeated in the first phase, the stillness of the chamber is broken by the movement of the younger prince. Lothric doesn't flee from the violence or cower in his bed. He descends from his resting place with a slow, deliberate movement that reveals the full extent of his frailty. He is impossibly thin, his skin a translucent pale that suggests a life lived entirely in the shadow of stone walls. He crouches over his brother's fallen body, and for the only time in the encounter, he speaks. "Oh, dear brother," he whispers, "I'm on my way." It's a line filled with a weary, intimate affection that underscores the depth of their connection. The miracle that follows is not a standard holy spell of the Way of White. Based on what the games show, it is a direct sharing of life force between the two tethered souls. Lothric embraces his brother's corpse, and a golden light erupts from the contact, pulling Laurian back from the brink of death. This is the true power of the symbiotic curse the royal family performed. Lothric is breathing his own vitality into the warrior who gave everything for him. He refuses to let death part them, even for a moment. He is the one who sustains the shield, proving that the master of this relationship is the frail boy on the back of the knight. This resurrection is a rejection of the natural order of life and death. In a world where hollowing and the curse have turned existence into a nightmare, the princes have found a way to use their shared soul as an anchor. They aren't interested in the cycle of the fire, but they are absolutely committed to the cycle of their own survival. Lothric climbs onto Lorian's back, his thin arms wrapping around his brother's neck in a gesture of absolute trust. They are no longer two individuals. They are a single, four-armed entity of pure defiance. This transformation is the moment the fight shifts from a duel into a tragedy of mutual dependency. The confirmed details suggest that this act of sharing life is what keeps the princes functional. Without Lothric's magic and soul force, Laurian would have remained a corpse. Without Laurian's strength and mobility, Lothric would have remained a prisoner of his bed. They have found a way to be whole in a world that has broken them both. The sight of the frail prince clinging to the back of the crawling knight is the most iconic image of their tragedy. It shows a love that's been warped by a curse, but strengthened by shared suffering. They are the only beings in the kingdom who've found a way to be truly inseparable. Lothric's voice during this phase is soft and melodic, lacking any trace of the madness that has claimed his father. He speaks of the firelink king as a curse, because he has experienced the literal fire of his brother's soul being shared with his own. He knows the cost of life better than anyone, because he has had to steal it from Laurian to stay awake. When he tells his brother to rise, for that is our curse, he isn't lamenting their fate. He is acknowledging the reality they have built together. They are bound by blood, magic, and choice, and they will face the end of the world in each other's arms. The miracle of resurrection serves as a gameplay mechanic that tells a narrative truth. You cannot simply kill the muscle to win the fight. You have to address the mind that sustains it. Lothric's willingness to drain himself to keep Laurian moving is a testament to his resolve. He isn't a passive victim, he is the mastermind of this rebellion. He is the one who's decided that as long as he lives, Laurian will live too. It's a beautiful and horrific display of brotherly devotion, a final act of grace in a city that's already turned to stone and ash. They are the twin princes, and they are finished with being tools. Part 19, Phase 2. One body, two souls. The second phase of the encounter presents the true form of the curse that bound the two brothers. Lothric clings to Laurian's back for the duration of the fight, whispering into his ear and guiding his movements with a symbiotic focus. They function as a single unit, where the muscle of the elder brother is guided by the magic and the will of the younger. Laurian continues to crawl and teleport, but his strikes are now punctuated by bursts of holy light and tracking sorceries fired over his shoulder by Lothric. It appears that the curse has achieved its goal of creating a unified soul, but in a way that the royal family never intended. This four-armed entity is a masterpiece of combat design that reflects the lore of their shared soul. They share health bars because the damage done to one is felt by the other. This isn't just a convenience for the player. It's a fundamental part of their narrative. You are damaging a single existence that's been divided between two broken bodies. Lothric provides the long-range pressure and the defensive magic, while Laurian provides the physical aggression. They are a perfect closed loop of support. The way Lothric leans into his brother's neck during the most intense moments shows a level of intimacy that's rare in the series. They are the only people who truly understand each other. The fighting style of the second phase is relentless. Lorian teleports more frequently, his strikes leaving trails of white light that Lothric then detonates with his own power. It's a synchronization that's been perfected over centuries of isolation in the topmost chamber. They don't need signals or words. They simply move in harmony. This is the repulsive act of the royal family rendered as a weapon. They tried to fix Lothric's frailty by cannibalizing Lorian. They succeeded in creating a lord that's stronger than either could have been alone. But this strength is now being used to ensure that the fire linking never happens. What little is confirmed suggests that the magic Lothric uses is a combination of the holy arts of the priestesses and the forbidden sorceries of the scholars. He has taken the tools of his education and turned them against his teachers. Every tracking bolt and every area of effect explosion is a rejection of the kingdom's destiny. He is using his soul to defend his brother, just as his brother is using his body to defend him. They are a paradox of the cycle. A lord of cinder who refuses to link the fire, but uses the fire's own logic to stay alive. They are the ultimate heresy, a union rooted in a curse, but justified by love. Lorian's role in this phase is to be the unyielding sword. He ignores his own pain and his own exhaustion to carry his brother through the battle. He moves with a purpose that's entirely defined by the boy on his back. If Lothric is the mastermind, then Lorian is the hands that execute his will. He teleports into the thick of the fight, placing himself between the player and the prince at every turn. He is the guardian who has finally found someone worth guarding. Their movements are a testament to the power of a shared soul to overcome the limitations of the flesh. They are a beautiful and tragic sight in the golden light of the chamber. The fight is the endurance test for the player, as you have to navigate the combined attacks of both brothers simultaneously. You are fighting the history of the Lothric bloodline in its most potent and its most broken form. They represent everything that the kingdom tried to build, but they've turned it into a sanctuary for themselves. They are the two people who've looked at the machinery of the world and decided to stay in bed. By the time you reach the midpoint of the second phase, you realize that you aren't just fighting a boss. You're fighting a relationship. You are trying to break a bond that survived the end of the world. Part 20. Killing Lorian. Again and again. One of the most devastating aspects of the second phase is the resurrection loop. If the player focuses their attacks on Lorian and drops him a second time, Lothric will immediately perform the life-sharing miracle again. The prince stays on the ground, glowing with a golden light, and waits for the warrior to rise. He will do this indefinitely. There is no version of this fight where Lorian stays dead while Lothric lives. The games establish the geometry of their relationship through this mechanic. To win, you must strike the frail prince on his brother's back. The fight only ends when the mastermind dies, and Lorian, finally relieved of his duty, dies with him. This mechanic forces the player to target the most vulnerable part of the entity. It's an uncomfortable tactical requirement. You are striking at a sickly, emaciated boy who is desperately trying to save his brother. Every time Lothric resurrects Lorian, it costs him a piece of his own life. You are watching a sacrifice happen in real time. The prince is willing to burn himself out to keep his knight on the floor. And this is the true nature of their symbiotic curse. It's not about strength leaking from the strong to the weak. It's about a shared pool of life that they both use to stay together. It's a tragic symmetry of effort and failure. Killing Laurian over and over feels like an act of cruelty. You are putting down a man who keeps getting back up out of a love that defies the laws of nature. Lorian has no voice to complain and no legs to run. He only has his sword and his brother. By forcing the resurrection, you are draining the very soul you were sent to collect. The game doesn't let you be a hero in this chamber. It forces you to be your executioner. You have to kill the love to get to the cinder. It's a brutal lesson in the reality of the fire-linking quest. You are the one who has to break the bond to save the world. The resurrection itself is accompanied by a massive explosion of light that pushes the player back. It's a defensive miracle that protects the brothers while they are most vulnerable. This light is a remnant of the sunlight of Gwynevere, a divine protection that's now being used to hide from the sun. Lothric is the source of this power, a priest of his own despair. He uses the tools of the gods to defy the gods. Every time Lorian rises, the prince's voice remains calm, reminding his brother of their shared curse. They are trapped in a loop of violence that they've accepted as the price of their togetherness. The final death of the princes is a quiet, simultaneous collapse. When Lothric's health is finally depleted, the golden light fades and both brothers fall to the floor. They die as they lived, together. There is no dramatic monologue or final plea. There is only the silence of a duty that has finally been extinguished. By killing the mastermind, you have released the shield. Laurian dies because he has no one left to protect, and Lothric dies because his soul has finally been taken by the cycle he tried so hard to avoid. It is a miserable victory that leaves the player alone in a room full of white feathers. The geometry of the relationship is the ultimate secret of the fight. You have to understand how they love each other to defeat them. You have to recognize that Laurian is just the shell and Lothric is the core. This is the final lesson of the Lothric bloodline. They built a lord out of two people, and you had to kill both to get the fire. The twins were the most successful experiment of the scholars, a pair of souls that couldn't be broken by anything but a determined cinder seeker. They go to their graves with their arms still wrapped around each other, the last lords of a kingdom that had already forgotten how to love. Section 7, The Last Words, Part 21. Mark my words, Ashen One, you remain among the accursed. Lothric's dying words are not a scream of agony or a threat of vengeance. They are a pitying warning. As the golden light fades and the brothers collapse, he looks at the player with a total, devastating clarity. He tells you to mark his words and reminds you that you remain among the accursed. He isn't angry at you for killing him. He's sorry for you. He sees that by succeeding in your mission, you have only ensured your own suffering. You have become the next piece of wood for a fire that will eventually go out anyway. He dies having understood the system completely, pitying the person who is still a slave to its mechanical requirements. This warning is a verdict on the player's entire journey. Lothric has spent his life studying the history of the lords and the failure of the cycles. He knows that linking the flame doesn't heal the world. It just delays the inevitable at the cost of the soul. By killing the princes and collecting their cinders, you are simply preparing yourself to be the next victim of the kiln. You are a cinder seeker, a person whose only value is their ability to burn. Lothric sees you as a tragic figure, a tool of a dead god who is too stubborn to let the lights go out. His final act is not to fight you, but to try to warn you of the trap you're walking into. The banner that appears across the screen after the battle reads Lord of Cinderfallen, despite the fact that Lothric never actually linked the fire. This is a deliberate narrative choice that carries heavy weight. The games confirm that he was destined for the throne, and by killing him, you have essentially treated him as if he had already fulfilled his duty. You have harvested the potential of his soul to use as fuel. To the fire, it doesn't matter if he was a willing hero or a reluctant rebel. It only cares about the heat he can provide. The title is a hollow one, a final mark of the machine's ownership over the boy who tried so hard to be free. Lothric's refusal was the most informed in the series because it was based on complete comprehension. He saw the repulsive acts of his family and the fire-linking curse for what they were. He didn't run from fear. He stayed because he understood. His death is the final proof of his philosophy. The cycle required his death to continue, and it used you to achieve it. He died a heretic, but he died with his eyes open. He is the only character who looks at the Ashen One and sees a victim rather than a savior. He dies in the dark, but he dies without the lie that has consumed the rest of the world. The weight of this warning lingers in the silence of the topmost chamber. You are left with the cinders of two brothers who just wanted to be left alone. You fulfilled the requirements of the three pillars and the high priestess, but you've done so by destroying the only people who were honest about the end. Lothric's pity is more cutting than his magic ever was. He leaves you with the realization that your victory is just the next step in a long, painful descent. You are the accursed, the one who has to carry the ash to the kiln, while the philosophers and the heretics find their peace in the dark. Ultimately, the prince's story ends with a question for the player. Was it worth it? You have the souls and you have the path to the end, but you've lost the moral high ground. Lothric's last words are a reminder that the world you are trying to save is a world that tortured a child and crippled a hero. By continuing the cycle, you are accepting the legacy of lords with all its blood and its lies. The prince's warning is the final obstacle of the game, a psychological barrier that asks you if you're willing to be a slave to the fire just because a god told you to be. He dies a winner in his own mind, leaving you with the burden of the accursed. Part 22. The Twin Princes' Great Sword. Their union is rooted in a curse and perpetuated by grief. The weapon forged from transposing the soul of the twin princes is a physical manifestation of their shared tragedy. It can only be created by merging two separate blades, Laurian's greatsword and Lothric's holy sword. The description of this combined weapon is one of the most poignant in the trilogy, stating that their union is rooted in a curse and perpetuated by grief. These 8 words contain the entire story of the brothers. The curse was something done to them by a desperate family, a mechanical tether they hadn't asked for. But the grief is what kept them choosing each other anyway. It was the shared pain of their existence that turned a shackle into a bond of love. Lorian's greatsword is a scorched, blackened slab of iron, a reminder of the hero he was before the ritual. Lothric's holy sword is an elegant platinum blade that never saw a day of combat. Together, they form a weapon that is both a tool of light and an artifact of shadow. This duality is the essence of the princes. One was the muscle, the other was the mind. One was the flame, the other was the light. They were inseparable in life, and the game ensures they are inseparable in their legacy. To wield the twin princes' great sword is to carry the weight of their symbiotic existence. It is a weapon that functions because of the very curse that ruined its owners. The phrase perpetuated by grief suggests that the brothers' refusal was born from the loss of everything they once valued. They had lost their parents to madness and disappearance. They had lost their health to experimentation, and they had lost their future to the fire. All they had left was their grief and each other. This shared sorrow is what allowed them to retreat to the highest point of the castle and wait for the end. They didn't want to rule a world that had caused them so much pain. They were content to be a unit of two, a private family in a public graveyard. Their union wasn't just a magical tether, it was an emotional sanctuary. The unique skill of the great sword is called Sacred Light and Flame. It allows the wielder to channel both the holy magic of Lothric and the scorched fire of Lorian. It is a powerful technique that requires the synchronization of two different styles of combat. This gameplay mechanic is a direct reflection of the princes' unity. They were stronger together than they were apart, and the weapon they left behind is proof of that fact. But the light it emits is a cold one, and the flame it carries is a blackened one. It is a weapon of the twilight, a tool for a world that has already decided to go dark. Item descriptions imply that this weapon is an artifact of a union that should never have happened. The royal family's repulsive acts created something that was both magnificent and horrific. The twin princes' great sword is a beautiful tragedy you can hold in your hands. It represents the ultimate failure of the Lothric bloodline to produce a traditional hero. Instead, they produced a bond that was so strong it could defy the cycle. The sword sits in the player's inventory as a reminder of the two brothers who looked at the fire and said no. It is a monument to a love that was forged in a laboratory, but tempered by 1,000 years of quiet devastation. Ultimately, the sword tells us that the prince's story was one of endurance rather than triumph. They didn't win their war against the cycle, but they didn't lose their bond to it either. They stayed together until the very end, and even in death, their souls remained fused into a single piece of steel. The grief that perpetuated their union is now the source of the weapon's power. It is a heavy blade to carry, a reminder that in the world of dark souls, the most powerful things are often the most broken. You are wielding the remains of a family that chose each other over the world, a union that's still rooted in a curse, but now belongs to you. Section 8. The Family They Came From, Part 23. Oceiros, After the Refusal. What obsession does to a father. When Prince Lothric finally refused to link the fire, King Oceiros didn't accept the failure of his laboratory. Instead, his obsession with the royal bloodline curdled into a total, devastating madness. He descended into the depths of the Grand Archives, seeking a way to fix the flawed legacy of his sons. He turned to the forbidden knowledge of Seath the Scaleless, a path that had already driven one duke into insanity. Oceiros became convinced that a child with dragon blood could succeed where his human heirs had failed. He transformed his own body into a disgusting dragon hybrid, fathering a third child named Ocelotta in a final, frantic attempt to produce a worthy Lord of Cinder. What the games establish is that Oceiros completely lost his grip on reality during this process. When the Ashen One finds him in the consumed king's garden, he is a horrific shadow of a ruler. He is a blind, emaciated beast who is cradling an invisible child. He begs Ocelot not to hide, speaking to the empty air as if his last hope was still in his arms. The tragedy is that the heir he sought to create was a monster, just like him. The royal bloodline had become a source of physical and mental rot. Oceiros was a man who'd sacrificed his humanity for a bloodline that had already rejected him. He was a king who was ruling over a nursery of shadows. So the records indicate that the fate of Ocelot was even more horrific than the game's final version suggests. The cut audio files for the encounter contain the sound of a baby crying and then being crushed in a fit of frenzy. While this was removed for the final release, the implication remains that Oceiros destroyed his own legacy in his madness. He was a father who'd spent his life trying to manufacture a champion, and in the end, he was alone in a garden of rot, talking to a ghost. He was the man who'd built statues of his son's destined triumph, and ended up as a beast who didn't even recognize his own failure. The machine of Lothric had consumed its architect. Environmental storytelling in the garden shows the total collapse of Oceiros' reign. The area is filled with the sludge of the archives and the failed experiments of the scholars. The king's obsession had turned the palace grounds into a toxic graveyard. He was a ruler who had forgotten his people, his kingdom, and his sons. He was only interested in the divine blood he'd been chasing since before Lothric was born. This is the ultimate end of the cycle's logic. If you value people only as fuel, eventually you stop seeing them as people at all. Oceiros saw his family as a series of experiments, and when the experiments failed, he went looking for a new one. The consumed king is a warning about the cost of refusing to let go. Gwyn had been afraid of the dark, and Oceiros was afraid of the end of his line. Both men broke the world to satisfy their fear. By the time you kill him, Oceiros isn't even aware of who you are or why you're there. He is a creature of pure instinct and obsession, a father who has been hollowed out by his own ambition. He died as he lived, clutching at a dream that was never real. He was the root of the prince's misery, the man who'd performed the repulsive acts and built the laboratory. He was the god who'd become a worm. Oceiros' story provides the necessary context for the prince's refusal. They weren't just rejecting a duty. They were rejecting a father who'd already turned them into propaganda. They saw the madness in the garden and the blood in the archives, and they decided that the cycle wasn't worth the price. The king's transformation into a dragon hybrid was the final proof that the royal bloodline was a curse. He'd traded the warmth of his family for the cold research of Saith, and he'd lost both. He is a tragic and disgusting figure, a reminder that obsession is the first step toward hollowing. He was the king of a golden city who died in a pit of his own making. Part 24, Lothric's Sword. Some things will remain, distant dreams forever. Young Lothric was meant to be a champion. He was expected to wield the platinum sword that had been crafted and blessed by Emma, the high priestess, long before he was even born. This weapon was a physical symbol of the glorious new age he was supposed to usher in, a masterpiece of metal and grace that was designed for a holy king. But the confirmed details of the prince's life tell a different story. Lothric was never able to hold the sword as a warrior. His hands were too weak to grip the hilt, and his body was too frail to carry the weight of a champion's duty. The sword remained in its original, pristine form, a relic of a future that never happened. The description of the Lothric holy sword is one of the most haunting in the game, stating that some things will remain distant dreams forever. 8 words that summarize the tragedy of a boy who was born into a destiny he couldn't fulfill. The platinum blade was a dream his father had for him, a dream the kingdom had for him, but it was never his own. He looked at that sword every day and saw only the disappointment of his bloodline. He didn't use it to lead armies or defend the fire. Instead, the games suggest he used it as a walking stick. It is a tragic visual of a divine weapon being used just to help a sick boy stand up. This image of the prince leaning on his platinum sword is the ultimate verdict on the kingdom's ambition. They had spent a fortune and committed countless crimes to produce a champion, and they had ended up with a cripple who needed a miracle blade just to walk across his room. The sword was a masterpiece of the machine, but the person it was made for was a victim of that same machine. It was a tool of light that was used in the service of a quiet, emaciated dark. Lothric didn't hate the sword, he just didn't care about it. To him, it was just a piece of metal that helped him move, not a symbol of a divine right. What little is confirmed suggests that the sword was blessed with the holy magic of the Lothric priestesses. It was supposed to fire rays of sacred light to destroy the enemies of the flame. But in Lothric's hands, that light was a defensive tool used to protect his brother. He didn't use the sword's power to conquer, he used it to survive. The contrast between the blade's original purpose and its final use is the essence of the heresy. Lothric took the sacred and made it personal. He took the divine and made it human. He refused to be the champion they wanted, but he became the brother his knight needed. The sword sits in the player's loot table as a proof of everything that was demanded of the prince and never given a chance to be real. It is a perfect, unused object from a world of ruins. It represents the potential that was burned away in the laboratory of the Grand Archives. Lothric's refusal to wield the sword as a warrior was his first act of rebellion. He wouldn't be the hero for a father he didn't respect or a kingdom he didn't love. He'd rather use the platinum blade as a crutch than as a weapon of the cycle. It is a quiet, domestic defiance that hits harder than any war cry. Ultimately, the platinum sword is a monument to the failure of engineering. You can manufacture the blade, and you can manufacture the bloodline, but you cannot manufacture the soul. Lothric's soul was a heretic's soul, a philosopher's soul, a brother's soul. It wasn't a champion's soul. The sword is a beautiful piece of equipment that tells an ugly story of expectation and disappointment. It is an artifact of a golden age that was already dead, a dream that was too heavy for a child to carry. When you hold the Lothric holy sword, you are holding the walking stick of a prince who chose to let the lights go out. Section 9. What Their Story Means. Part 25. The most informed refusal in the series. The refusal of Prince Lothric is unique among the Lords of Cinder because it was the only one based on complete intellectual comprehension. Other lords fled from their thrones for personal reasons. Yhorm was broken by grief, Aldrich was driven by a dark ambition, and the Abyss Watchers were consumed by the madness of the blood. But Lothric's refusal was an act of high philosophy. He had the best education in the world, the best historical evidence of the cycle's failure, and the lived experience of being the cycle's intended fuel. He looked at the entire history of the world and saw the cycle for what it truly was, a mechanical trap that didn't deserve to continue. Based on what the games show, Lothric was the only character who arrived at his decision through logic and study. He wasn't running from fear. He was standing still from conviction. He had read the forbidden scrolls of the scholars and heard the whispers of the first scholar. He understood that the fire linking was a shackle Gwyn had placed on humanity, a lie that had been used to maintain a stagnant age of fire long after its time had passed. His refusal was a verdict on the entire concept of the cycle. He wasn't just staying in his room to avoid the pain of the kiln. He was staying because he believed that letting the fire fade was the only moral choice left. This makes his refusal the loneliest and the most lucid in the series. He was a child in a machine who had complete knowledge of how the machine worked, and he decided to let it stop. He didn't want to be a savior of a lie. He didn't want to be a god of a graveyard. He chose to embrace the quiet dark because he believed it was the only way to be truly free of Gwyn's ancient sin. This wasn't an act of weakness. It was an act of comprehension. Lothric was a hero of the dark, not out of malice, but out of a simple desire for the world to stop hurting. He was the only one who saw that the only way to win was to stop playing. The prince's story tells us that knowledge is a dangerous thing in the Age of Fire. If you look too closely at the foundations of the world, you will see the cracks and the blood. Lothric looked closer than anyone else. He saw the repulsive acts and the fire-linking curse, and he decided that he'd rather be a heretic than a lord. He was the endpoint of the cycle's own education system. The scholars had taught him too well. They had given him the tools to understand the world, and he'd used those tools to dismantle their religion. He was a master of the logic of the end, the lord who finally understood that the lights needed to go out. To the player, Lothric is a boss to be defeated, but to the law, he is the most important witness. He is the only one who looks at the Ashen One and sees a victim rather than a hero. He understands that by killing him and taking his cinders, you are only ensuring your own destruction in the kiln. He dies pitying you because he knows exactly what you're about to do. His refusal is a warning that the cycle is a trap, a circular march into the ash that offers no true victory. He is a tragic figure because he is the only one who is right. He found his peace in the dark, and he leaves you with the burden of the accursed. Ultimately, Lothric represents the total exhaustion of the dream of fire. He is a prince who has run out of world to believe in. His refusal is the logical conclusion of 1,000 years of failure. He didn't link the fire because he didn't believe the fire was worth his brother's soul or his own humanity. He was a man who chose the honesty of the dark over the deception of the light. He is the heart of the game's melancholy, a voice of reason at the end of the world. He was the heir who refused, the lord who understood, and the child who finally found a reason to say no. Part 26. The brother who never got a speech. In the middle of the complex philosophy and the royal propaganda, Laurian remains the unsung hero of the twin princes. Lothric gets the dialogue, the theories, and the intellectual justifications for their rebellion. Lorian gets none of it. He is mute from the curse, his voice stolen by the magic that tethered his soul to his brothers. But his story is told entirely through what he did. He was the one who killed the demon prince. He was the one who accepted the crippling, and he was the one who fought for his brother without a single word of complaint. His love is expressed only through action, which is the only form of love in Laurian that actually holds. Based on what the games show, Lorian's silent devotion is the most human thing in the entire series. In a world where gods burn themselves for fire and kings go mad for bloodlines, Laurian gave himself up for a brother who was born a failure by the kingdom's standards. He didn't care about the high philosophy of Aldia or the political survival of the Lothric state. He only cared about the frail boy who was being tortured in the laboratory. He chose to be his brother's shield and his brother's legs, a decision he reaffirmed every time he teleported into a fight or crawled across a floor. He is a warrior whose honor was found in a domestic loyalty. Lorian's silence is a powerful contrast to the noise of the rest of the world. He doesn't need to argue for his refusal. He just lives it. He is the unyielding sword of the prince, a man who has traded his crown for a crutch. Every time you kill him in the boss fight and Lothric raises him back up, you are witnessing the depth of their bond. Lorian doesn't hesitate to stand again. He doesn't regret the curse. He rises because Lothric is there, and that is all the reason he needs. He is a hero who's found his purpose in a person rather than a cause. He is the physical manifestation of a love that's been tempered by 1,000 years of grief. The twin princes' great sword skill is called Sacred Light and Flame, a title that perfectly summarizes their union. One brother was the light of the soul, and the other was the flame of the sword. They are inseparable, a single entity that's been forged in the fire of their shared tragedy. Lorian provided the strength that Lothric lacked, and Lothric provided the soul that Lorian had sacrificed. Together, they were the ultimate lords of Cinder, not because of their bloodline, but because of their devotion. Lorian's silence is a testimony to a love that doesn't need words. He is the brother who stayed when everyone else walked away. Ultimately, Lorian is the character who reminds us that the cycle is not just about gods and fire. It's about people. He was a titan of the battlefield who decided that being a brother was more important than being a king. He gave up his legs and his voice to share the burden of a child who'd no choice in his own destiny. His sacrifice is the reason Lothric was strong enough to say no. They had each other, and in the end, that was more than the fire could ever offer. Laurian is the unsung hero of the end, a silent sentinel who died with his arms around his brother, finally free of the duty that had ruined them both. Their story is a masterpiece of environmental and mechanical storytelling. You see the feathers, you hear the music, you fight the four-armed beast, and you realize that you've destroyed something beautiful to satisfy a requirement of the fire. Lorian's devotion is the final truth of the Lothric bloodline. They tried to build a machine, and they built a family. The princes were the end of the age of fire, and they were the start of the quiet dark. Lorian never got a speech, but he didn't need one. His life was his message, and his message was love. He was the twin prince who chose to crawl so his brother could speak.